Hi everyone, this is Grace, and today I will be walking you through how to make this Mardi Gras set. Excited as always, let's go. So first up, we have got the mask. And for this entire set, so I did something a little different if you followed me for a while. This is a different style than I typically do. Certainly not something that I came up with. And it's a style where you flood the cookie first with a base color, and then you do the design on top of that, if that makes sense. And the reason to do that is if you're working with a design that naturally, because of the shape of the design and the shape of the cutter, the design doesn't completely cover the cookie cutter, if that makes sense. So with the example of this mask, the cutouts in the center for the eyes, obviously, there aren't cutouts in this cookie, and I think that was the smart thing to do because this is a pretty small cutter. These are meant to be mini size, but the ones I'm using are actually the 3-inch version of the Mardi Gras. I think it's called the Mardi Gras Minis set from Cut It Out Cutters. I wanted something a little bit bigger. They're not quite standard size, but they're certainly bigger than minis, which is my jam, because even though I've done a good amount of mini sets, I personally don't really enjoy mini set. They're just so small. I like the simplicity of them, but I don't really like cutting out such small cookies. Not always decorating such small ones either, but anywho. So the cutouts I'm doing right here. You have a choice to make when you're dealing with a design that has a cutout or negative space that the cutter doesn't account for. You can just leave the cookie bare. That's totally fair. One thing to consider with that, if you leave the cookie bare, is that the more cookie that's exposed to the air, the faster it will dry out or, become stale. So it's always best if you can to cover the surface of the cookie. That said, if you're making these for yourself or for a client that doesn't like as much icing, and you're doing designs where there's a lot of negative space and it doesn't cover the whole cookie, maybe that's a good thing. You also need to keep in mind, obviously, what your actual naked cookie looks like. Like, does it have a nice, pretty flat surface to it? Or does it have kind of a bumpy surface? Just keep that in mind because that's obviously going to be showing. So this set had quite a few designs where there were kind of cut out or negative spaces. Not all of them, but enough of them where I had to make a decision about how I wanted to address that negative space. So I chose to do this technique, which does result in quite a lot of icing. It sure does. So flip side, if you're making these cookies for a client or customer, friend, family member that doesn't like a lot of icing, this is probably not the right design technique to go for. I just want to take a pause here on what I'm doing right here, which is pressure piped. What is this called? Pressure piping. If you've ever seen me do like pressure piped hearts or the sweater technique, this is the same exact motion. So you're piping a bead of icing, and as you pull away from the icing, you're releasing pressure at the same time. It's a lot of multitasking, and it's harder than it looks, I promise. For that kind of technique, you do need to use a medium peak. If you use something softer, they're going to melt together too much. I would say based on the look of my icing, it's like just shy of a medium peak. A medium peak would usually hold a little bit more shape than this is, but this is good enough. And then the yellow dots I did with a soft peak because I didn't want them to have peaks on them. Have a soft peak. And I'm using a scribe here to help settle the dots because I really wanted them to be spherical dots. So there's the mask. Cutie patootie. And next up is the king cake. So back to the design element here. I really love the end result with these cookies. I love the white contrast against the designs. The downsides downsides to this technique. We already talked about it being a lot of icing, if that's a downside to you. The second thing is that you don't have the guidance as much of the shape of the cutter. So a lot of this, I felt like I was freehanding it much more, which you'll see more as we go. I mean, you saw that with the mask too, but that's a little scarier, I think, especially for a beginner to have to freehand. If you are going to do this technique and you're nervous about that, it would be good to have a projector so you can project the image onto the cookie and trace that. If you don't have a projector, you can use tissue paper. Print out the image first. You're going to need the exact size, which is a little hard. But if you can get the right size of the image, print it out, use tissue paper to trace the image, then use an edible marker, trace the image with an edible marker, by the way, then put the image on top of the icing and trace that with your edible marker. Of course, your icing is going to have to crust enough for that to happen, which is going to play into something else I want to talk about. So this here, you're going to see, and you saw that with the mask, that I used an outline for the mask. That's because there were cutouts there, and I really needed precise cutouts. And the icing, so I used an outline for the majority of the designs here. Obviously not with this one, and honestly, it was just because I was lazy and I was reusing old icing that wasn't thick enough to have an outline and a flood. It was already a flood consistency, so I just rolled with the flood. But what's really important about this design is you want to have the right amount of white space on the outside of the cookie. So if your icing floods out a little bit too much, like smushes out too much, then you're going to lose that beautiful white contrasted border. With this one, so my icing is a little on the thin side for doing this kind of technique, which means that when I was piping the outlines of the shapes of this king cake, I made them a little smaller than I ultimately needed or wanted, because the icing kind of flattened out a bit. Now, what I want to talk about in terms of circling back to the tracing an image conversation is that something you're going to struggle with, and I struggled with this kind of technique, is cratering. I don't know all of the science behind cratering, but I've learned some things here or there from friends, from other cookiers. I'm still trying to master it myself. I'm going to be totally honest here. So you've seen me do squiggles before, like you saw me do on the mask, and that is to help prevent cratering. Cratering is when the icing, when it dries, it sinks in the middle, and it can be anything from just like a little dip to an actual hole in the surface of your icing. And it's something to do with, if anyone knows the exact science on this, please drop it in the comments. It is something to do with, as the icing dries, the moisture gets pulled down by something like the weight of the meringue powder and the icing or something. There's the cute little king cake. And when you're doing a design like this, where you're flooding, or anything where you flood a base and then you're going to put something on top of it that you're afraid is going to crater, word on the street, and again, I am no expert at this, but word on the street is that the best way to go about that is to make sure that your base layer has not completely dried. You want it to just barely crust, and then put your design on top of it. And the reasoning behind that is that if the base layer is already dry, as the second layer dries, the base layer will start to pull moisture from the second layer into the first layer, and that will extra make it crater. But I gather then, if we're talking about the the reverse here, so if the base layer is not totally dry, it already has moisture in it, so it's not going to be pulling moisture from the top layer. Are we following? Okay. So I had wanted to do that with this set, but I will admit I made a basic mistake at the beginning, which is that I decided to flood all of the cookies in white at the same time. The problem with that is that I naturally could not work fast enough to do all of the second layers before the first layers had dried too much. So I should really look back and figure out which cookies I flooded first and see if those cratered any less than the ones that I flooded, or I did the details second. Actually, that's something curious to know. I'm gonna pause and I'm gonna come back and figure that out. Okay, I now have that information, which debunks my theory here. I will share that later when I get to that cookie. Anywho, let's keep going with this crown. So, right. One of these days I'm going to be on top of it and I'm going to make sure that I do a second layer while the first layer is still wet or not wet, but wet underneath the crust, and see if that helps with cratering. But let's talk about this crown. So, all right, we are doing some wet on wet here, some very basic wet on wet. And I'm going to be using one of my 3 scribes here. So when I decorate, I always have 3 scribes and my little pair of scissors, no matter what. So the 3 scribes serve different purposes. This is my thinnest scribe. The little end is the smallest. This is from Amazon. It's in my Amazon shop. It is PME brand, I want to say. Don't quote me on that. I think it's PME. And this is great when you need very little agitation. So when you're doing wet on wet like this, the size of that pull is going to depend on how big your scribe is, how big the needle is. So this is the smallest one you can get, and I use this for something really small. Now, if I wanted a bigger pull, I have other scribes that are bigger. So I have a bigger metal one that is from, or I would say it's my medium size one. That's from Borderlands Bakery. I love it because it's the most ergonomic of all of them. It has a heart on the end, which just rests on my hand perfectly. And then the third one I have is the Thingamajiggy from the Cookie Countess. It's this pink one. It's the thickest one. It's plastic, and it has a scraper tool on the end of it, which comes in super handy. I use it all the time while I'm decorating. That one is the biggest tip, so it's the biggest agitation, and I tend to use that in really, like, if I need to cover a lot of surface area really quickly, or settle something pretty big. Oh, there we go. There's my Thingamajiggy. In this instance, I mean, I didn't really, like, this application right here, it doesn't really matter which scribe I use. I just tend to, like, pick up the one that is closest. And then I'm using Soft Peak here for these dots. Jiggling them out just a little bit as I pipe. And then once I'm done piping, then I am going to use my scribe. Here we go. So in this instance, which scribe to use? The bigger the scribe tip, if you're going to have any little bit that sticks up after you pull the scribe out, the bigger it's going to be, right? The bigger the scribe is that you're working with. So there we go. That is the crown. Up next, we have the string of beads. I did do a 1 consistency outline in flood for all of the white. I do color my white icing always. I didn't used to, but now I do with the Sugar Art Master Elite in white. Highly recommend. You can also use a gel coloring if you have, like, AmeriColor does a good white. I think Chef Master does too, I believe. I don't have much in the way of Chef Master. I have mostly AmeriColor, some Wilton, and some Sugar Art Master Elites. The thing to keep in mind, of course, if you're using a Master Elite, it's a pigmented powder and it has to be activated in liquid first. So dab some on top of your icing. Use a dropper to put some water on top of it, and then activate it with, like, the back of your spoon or your spatula first, then mix it in. So the one downside to Master Elites is that you have to add liquid in order to use them. And if you're using a consistency that's already where it needs to be and you can't make it any thinner, then you may not want to use Master Elites. So that's the only time when I'm using a white that I don't use the Master Elite is if it's already kind of on the thin end. So this cookie I actually did last when I decorated, and that was because I needed the tips of my soft peak bags to be bigger for these gigantic dots. I tried, like you can do this with a smaller tip, but you're going to get a hand cramp real soon. I tried the first cookie, I think, with a smaller tip, and I was like, nope. I need to cut this bigger, which is what I did. And I kind of, just a note for myself, this kind of piping, so I usually am piping at an angle, which is not something I really registered for the longest time. But something like this, I'm actually holding my bag perpendicular to the cookie. I don't know why. I guess I feel like I have better control. It's the motion. I'm not really sure. But what that does when you're filming it is that your hand tends to get in the way. I am filming from the side, but it's not too severe of a side angle. So if I'm holding normally I have my hand kind of tilted away from the camera because I'm piping at an angle, but in this case, I have my hand closer to the camera because it's upright, it's perpendicular. So side note, if I can remember this the next time I do something like this, I am going to try to pipe at an angle just so that it looks prettier on camera. And because side note, friends, I do that quite often. There are adjustments that I make to my decorating when I'm filming to make it more visually pleasing. They're the beads. Now, I just say that like with any social media, what you see is the polished version, often, mostly. And that includes my videos. In these real times, I try to show more of the kind of the stuff that sometimes gets left out when I do a sped up video. But just keep that in mind, that you're seeing the best parts. So I already forgot what I just said. Yeah, I completely lost my train of thought. All right. What else can we talk about here? So, this cookie. Oh, man. All right. So once in a blue moon, I do forget to record a portion of a cookie. And unfortunately, this cookie saw that fate. So what happened was, this is the hat, and I failed to film, I think there are 3 portions of the hat. That is the second portion. I tried to scrape it off and then reflood it and refilm it. It looked terrible, obviously, because I just scraped off the colored layer from the, the green and the purple from the white, and it just looked awful. But I redid it and I was like, whatever, something's better than nothing, right? And when you, of course, photograph the cookie, no one knows the difference. No one would have known if I was selling these cookies or giving these cookies to someone that I redid that portion. But considering I'm a content creator and the whole point here is to make videos, right? When I woke up, the next morning, I'd already finished the whole set. I hate redoing things. I'm a one and done kind of gal. But I woke up and I was just like, Grace, you gotta redo the video. You gotta redo the portion of the video because who knows, you may want to reshare this set one day and it would be a real bummer to not have good footage. And actually, this was the most labor intensive of all of the designs. This was like an 8-minute cookie, and these are pretty small cookies. So for it to take 8 minutes means there are a lot of portions to it, a lot of sections. So I completely redid it. And the benefit here to doing the white flood first is I had already filmed the white flood. So what I did was I scraped the entire bit of icing off from the white all the way to the top. which was a bit of a challenge because the icing was dry at this point, and scraping completely dry icing off can be hard, pun intended, unless the cookie is, if the cookie is really old, then sometimes the icing just kind of comes off all in one clump very easily. But if it's newly dry, it's still very much like attached to the cookie. So I painstakingly got all the icing off with a knife. I reflooded it in white, which I did not film because it looked terrible. Obviously, the surface of the cookie was awful, but I reflooded it and made myself a nice new surface. And that is where I started here on this white flood. So that was a new flood. But no one knows, you can tell, and I've only done this in a rare occasion when I'm desperate. You can tell that someone redid a cookie or redid a filming if there's a base layer of coloring either on the cookie or on the icing or something. That means they scraped it off and then redid it. The challenge for me is that I almost always film the last cookie of a design. So if I mess up, if I forget to film something, it's the last one and I'm kind of SOL, my friends. So that's where I was with this one. But anywho, so I know you're all going to ask me, what are the squiggles? We already talked about the squiggles, right? The squiggles are to prevent craters. And in this case, these are pretty small areas. Yeah, and I ask myself this time all the time, is it really necessary to put the purple under the purple and the green under the green? Since I'm doing like this wet on wet next to each other, can't you just do the whole thing in purple or green and save yourself a second? Maybe, but I've never tried it and I'm not about to test it out because I don't know. I have this fear that if I put purple under the green, as it starts to dry, the purple is going to bleed through the green. I mean, it seems rational, but I just have never tried it and I don't know if I ever will because maybe one day, for the sake of y'all, I will actually try it and I will tell you how it goes. So I'm doing wet on wet here. I'm doing flooding in sections. We got a lot going on. To simplify this one, by the way, you can just do each of the hat thingies in different colors, like maybe the ones on the bottom green and then one on the top purple, or one purple, one green, one yellow. That would certainly make it easier, but I want to mix it up here. Also, this is just actually the design of the cutter. So, you'll see if you ever buy cutted out cutters that she actually draws out all of the designs on the cutters. Not all cutter makers do that. But if I'm feeling kind of either uninspired and my creative juices aren't really flowing, or I just really like the design of the cookie to begin with, then I will just use it as is. You can see when I do, by the way, I should have mentioned, when I do the second color, I pipe a line on top of the previous color, if that makes sense. That's the cleanest way to join them, not to flood up against the previous color. I hope I'm making sense. Definitely should have talked about that. Definitely mentioned that in other videos, but yeah. So here we go with a little floody flood. All right, you're gonna see here, so you see that kind of dark line in the middle? That is a telltale sign that my icing has separated or started to separate. And that's because I'm using icing from the night before, from the day before. I left it out. I tried to mix it up as much as I could, but I guess I didn't do a good enough job. What I really should have done, because it was sitting overnight, was to actually take the icing out of the bag and then give it just, all you have to do is just give it a good little mix in the bowl and then you're done. It's good. But I just, y'all, I was already redoing a video. I just didn't have it in me. But you can see there, I use my scribe to kind of swirl it around and mix it back into itself. And you can barely tell in the finished cookie. This is a soft peak here with my yellow. think I'm going to use a scribe here, I hope. Yeah, I'm using a scribe to just kind of settle the little tips down. Et voila! This might actually be my favorite video at this point, although I really like the king cake, I'm going to be honest. So we did get a little bit of cratering there, a little bit of cratering. This one was V stressful. Why, Grace? Why was it V stressful? Well, my friends, okay, it's because there was so much design to it that I had to freehand. You're gonna see though how I marked it. Now, if you've watched, actually, I don't think I've shared these quite yet, but if you watch any, oh no, right, on the YouTube, if you watch the compilation, the sped up one, I left out some parts in that video that you're going to see here that you did not see there because those bits were not necessary and not satisfying to watch and go by very quickly. But when you're actually trying to learn how to do this, you do need to see what I'm about to do, which is, so I've got my smallest scribe here and I'm actually poking holes in the surface of the icing. Got to be careful here, obviously. You don't want to poke too big of a hole. I'm doing this to mark my space. So you can't see the dots here, but when I was actually decorating, I could definitely see the holes in the surface of the icing. And I did this instead of using an edible marker because when you mark a design or space or lettering with edible marker, you have to make sure that you're going to be able to actually flood on top of it or like completely cover the line, and sometimes that can be hard and challenging. So I just find it safer if you can to just poke a little hole in the surface. So after I poke those little markers, then I'm going through with a soft peak piping consistency and I am marking out the outline of this Fleur-de-lis. And again, if this is something that really intimidates you, then I suggest using a projector or the tracing method to trace this on first. For me, I considered using a projector, but I didn't for two reasons. Number one is, again, going back to adjusting my decorating to make it more visually pleasing to film. I don't think that watching the projector is as satisfying to watch. So for that reason, I wanted to try kind of freehanding it. And also, you know, cookies are cookies. Like, these are works of art. These are little works of art. And yeah, by freehanding it, then each one is going to be a little different. And I think that's okay. These are not, I'm not a robot. I'm not a machine. Neither are you. If people want robot cookies, they can go get robot cookies from somewhere else. But these are, handmade, hand touch. So for that reason, I'm like, whatever. It's fine if they all look a little different. And also, it's a good growth moment, I think, to kind of really trust yourself, trust in the process. So this cookie I found particularly disappointing in the crater department. You're going to see when this dries, they aren't terrible, but these sections do crater. And I look back and I go, okay, so what could I have done differently to get these not to crater? And I think one thing is to push the limit and add even more icing. Now that can be challenging. It can overflow pretty easily, especially if you're using really thin icing. But I think that is one area where I could have added a bit more. I'm looking at this yellow section first. You can see my little boo-boo there. So I accidentally pulled out my flood icing, not my piping consistency. I I get asked all the time too with these zigzags, these doodle, whatever you call them. Do I let them dry or do I flood right away? You can tell here that I'm flooding right away because they are still shiny. And I do think that's the way to go. My theory is that it will just marry better together if it's wet to wet as opposed to dry to wet. Because if you follow that theory of the 2 layers of icing, then if that squiggle on the bottom is already dry, then it might pull moisture from the top. I don't know. Again, if anyone's got any actual science behind this, please drop your knowledge in the comments. Would love to know. The thing that baffles me is that the green section in the middle, the darker green section that I do last, was actually nice and puffy. So let's see if we can tell in real time why that would make sense. My theory is that I used a lot more icing than I did on the other sections, because I know that when I'm doing a middle section like that, it can handle a lot more icing. And actually, now that I'm saying that out loud, I really wish that I had done the purple and the green on the outsides first and then the yellow on the inside, because then I would have had the security of kind of having the yellow partly kind of held in by the purple and the green, and probably would have added more icing. But why did I choose not to do that? That's a really good question, because I still have to do this in 3 phases no matter what. Because right now I did the center, then the sides, then the dark green bit. But if I did the outsides first, I do the outside, then the yellow, then the dark green. That's still 3 phases. So, y'all, I don't know. I don't know. It's also, well, that's a pretty good amount of icing I put in there. That squiggle was like, that's not just a squiggle. Maybe that's part of it. See, I'm learning along with you. I'm completely self-taught. So there are things that I do that go well and I don't know why. And there are things that I do that don't go well and I don't know why. And it's been a journey, especially since I started teaching, figuring out, see, you can see the craters and the lighting. Oh, man. All right. Next up, we have Louisiana. In this set, you might be wondering what the state shapes are. We've got Louisiana, we've got Alabama. And that is because while today New Orleans in Louisiana is most well known for Mardi Gras, I believe it was Mobile. Oh, I should know this. Mobile, Alabama had the first Mardi Gras parade ever, not New Orleans. So that is why there's Alabama in here. I also believe that the owner of Cut It Out Cutters lives in Alabama. So obviously she has Alabama pride and would know that piece of information, because I certainly did not know that. Ooh, man, you can see at the end of my bag poking in to my field of vision here. No bueno. What I should have done, and what I normally do, is cut the ends of my bags so I don't get any unwieldy long bits of bag, especially towards the end when I have less and less icing in my bag. Obviously the end bit gets bigger. All right, so I was most nervous, I think, with this one, that doing this outline or this design element would look silly with the states, because obviously they don't need it. Now, I did not do Louisiana geographically accurate here. I mean, the general shape is accurate, but New Orleans, the New Orleans area, where I'm gonna show you later when I put the little heart on it, actually has like waterways or whatever. Canals? Are they? Someone who knows geography better here, correct me. Anyway, it's not just one land, like one perfectly intact landmass like this. It has water is the point here. Okay. Something else to talk about. So I did the outlines here and then I flooded them. Now, I just want to mention that the flood consistency I used is somewhere between, I know you're going to hate me here, a thick and a thin flood. I know why. I have these measures for the general ideas of where I want icing based on different uses. And what I tell you, right, is that if you're going to do a 2 consistency outline in flood, which is essentially what this is, that you should use a thin flood. Now I'm kind of breaking my own rules here. I knew these are smaller cookies, so I wanted, okay, here's the heart is going where New Orleans generally is. That is medium peak piping consistency on that yellow. Cute. So I use somewhere between a thick and a thin flood because these are smaller cookies, so I don't have to worry as much about my icing crusting too quickly. And it's a smaller area, right? So I want to have maximum poof. I don't know why my voice went so much higher. Maximum poof in the icing, even though, so those smaller areas could have used even thicker icing, but I don't know. I went through a period where like that Fleur-de-lis I would have done completely in soft peak piping. And I don't know, I'm kind of out of that phase right now. I'm back to using flood and just doing the squiggle and crossing my fingers. I don't know. When I do the soft peak, I'm usually too lazy to help it settle enough so you don't see any evidence of it being a soft peak, which I get the poof, but then I don't get a nice smooth top, and then I'm a little sad inside. So anyway, this is Alabama. This white, though, is definitely more like a thick flood. And I'm doing a true 1 consistency outline in flood for those. This is some good practice with line work. Lift that bag off the surface. This is probably like up to 1/2 inch, I would say, when I get to the longer stretches. That's the best way to get a really good, clean line. And in this case, I was not waiting for the outlines to dry. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. In this case, it's a pretty small surface area, and I'm not afraid of the icing falling over the edge. So I'm going in right away and flooding it, because also if you flood right away, then you can kind of help marry the outline and the flood a little bit better together. If they're still wet, if they're both wet when you flood. But that said, especially if you're a beginner, definitely let the outline dry, because if you're not a super confident piper flooder, then it's very easy to accidentally like mess with that's the location, the approximate location of Mobile. I believe, someone please tell me I'm right. I'm pretty sure that's what it is. I lost my train of thought again. Location. Right. Let the outline dry, because that's what's going to give you the most secure moat around your flood. I have had times where I like bump up against a wet outline when I'm trying to flood it, and that's no good, no bueno. That said too, if I'm using like a really thick outline or really thick consistency outline and it dries really fast and like really crusty, that can also be a problem. And I've also knocked off pieces of an outline once it has dried too much, but that's a conversation for another day. All right, we have the cookie here that actually says Mardi Gras. I don't know why I just said it like that. When I do this, by the way, I am actually sticking the scribe into the surface of the cookie to jiggle it. You got to be kind of careful when you do that, though. Yeah, be careful. You also don't want to use too big of a scribe because that's obviously going to poke like a gigantic hole in your cookie. Don't poke it all the way through too. So I'm doing this lettering here. This was lettering done by Cut It Out Cutters, the person that designed these cutters. And I'm going to be totally honest here. This is probably my least favorite kind of lettering. It's like pressure piping. I mean, it is pressure piping, but it's not the bouncy pressure piping. The reason why I don't like this is that, at least the way I do it, which you can see here, I am giving consistent pressure all the way down in their long downstrokes. There's no like release, and it's really hard to pipe straight and smooth, consistent, thick downstrokes like this. If I had more patience, what would I do? I would use a scribe after I piped each letter to help it settle, but I don't have that much patience. Also, okay, a couple of things that drove me crazy about this. First of all, I did not intend to pipe Mardi in purple. Whoops. I was going to do it all different colors, but I just got totally lost in piping the lettering, and then I finished it and I was like, oh shoot. So I had to kind of pivot and figure out how I was going to finish it off to still make it look kind of funky like I wanted. And then the second thing, if you've ever used a projector, getting the shadows right is a struggle. As you can see, I can barely, like, my hand is covering the projector as I'm lettering, which kind of defeats the purpose, right? And I think once I finished the cookies, I realized there was something off about my setup. I can't remember what it was. If I had a light on and I shouldn't have had a light on, or something that was creating this extra shadow that made it very challenging. And when I finished, I realized I had it set up wrong. And I was like, oh, Grace. What am I doing? Fake out there, fake out. Oh, nope. Oh, that's what I fixed, you can see it there. I fixed my lighting and I was like, Grace. Okay. Here is edible glitter, diamond dust, white diamond by the Sugar Art. And I think here, fake out, my projector went back on, which is what that weird coloring is. But anyway, that's the last cookie. This is the whole set. How did we get to the end so quickly? I don't know why I got so high either. So I hope that you enjoyed this thoroughly, that you try some of this yourself. If you're celebrating Mardi Gras, happy Mardi Gras. Yeah, I had a lot of fun with this set, a lot of fun with this technique. I hope y'all have a fantastic rest of your day, and I'll check you later. Have a sweet one.